Hey everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started with the 11:30 presentation, which is on making a maker city. But I actually want to start out with something that I'm kind of proud of. It's part of the character of making. This screen actually has all sorts of extra stuff at the bottom because we had an audio-visual challenge. What's the solution? We raised the screen. You have no idea that there's a big problem down here, but just by raising the screen, all that is lost behind. So a maker process of learning and trial and error comes through for us again here. So the topic now is making a maker city. What I'm going to describe to you is a process that we've seen play out time and time again across the country. And I'm going to give you an indication of where it is this is all going. But the way I'm going to do that is by way of telling you a story, a brief story that gives you background. It's essentially an odyssey that I went on over the course of a few years and watched play out. And it's a very similar story to what it is, given that I'm as old as I am, have seen a few times in the past play out. So for instance, I was doing personal computing before there was the IBM PC, before there was the Apple. It started off with lots of hardware hackers fiddling around in garages around the country. It started off with hundreds, actually I think it was thousands of little computer companies that were doing their own thing before the standardization came along. Then you saw the IBMs and the Apples come in. Then you saw so many other things happen. And that process played out with cell phones. It played out with the internet. It's a cycle we're seeing happening now. And it's with regard to not Dell computer, but my slides when they come back up. The next slide is, go ahead. The first in this process, which is the process of discovery. And for me, it was a 2-year journey across a lot of places that led me to the point where I can talk about what's called Maker City. And I was at the time the chairman of a small business startup incubator. And I was running around the southern United States to just visit other incubators to learn some best practices. When I arrived at the end of that trip, I just happened to be in the Bay Area for Bay Area Maker Faire of 2010. And what I saw there kind of blew my mind. I only went on a fluke, but what I saw there kind of blew my mind because people were doing things that should not have been possible. We had kids who were designing things and printing them on 3D printers. We had people doing things with electronics that I just couldn't imagine doing at the time. I was trained as an industrial and manufacturing engineer. I knew about fabrication, and yet these kids were just doing so much more than I knew was possible. And it's important for me to share with you just what those things were that were so stunning to me, because they're really at the root of what it is that we're talking about here, this maker movement. What the factors are, what the ingredients here are really just a continuation of the benefit of computing power and the reduction in cost. And so we ended up with tools. Tools is the one big thing that changed. All of a sudden, tools were easier to use. A 3D printer was straightforward. A vinyl cutter was more straightforward. They were accessible, and they were safe. So tools are more powerful, they're easier to use, they don't take as long to learn how to use. Another factor was in the sharing. That is to say, in the proprietary world of corporates, you end up with all sorts of things being designed and then kept to themselves. But after the open source movement, people are sharing designs, people are sharing builds of material, people are sharing so much more. And so instead of starting from scratch, if I want to do a project, I can just go ahead and download something and modify it. So between tools and sharing, you have very powerful ingredients. Add to that collaboration. We've been collaborating over the internet for 15, 20 years now, but you couldn't collaborate around hardware because you couldn't do hardware easily. Now you can. So these ingredients of tools and sharing and collaboration were the magic that was playing out in what we see here, in this festival. Let's go to the next page. I was really wanting to understand what was going on, so I went to, first, maker spaces. This was the stage of making where you couldn't find it in schools. You couldn't find it in all these other institutions you see up here. You had to go to the little garages or the old industrial building or the converted retail location to find a bunch of guys and gals who've gotten together and wanted to play with these tools. They wanted to get into this stuff. And that was at makerspaces. So over the course of a couple of years, I visited about 110, 120 makerspaces in the UK, Canada, and the United States, and started my own in Northern Virginia called Nova Labs. Now, makerspaces you can still find. We have some examples of makerspaces over here in this corner, such as Fab Lab, such as Open Source Maker Labs, Vocademy. These are the kinds of things you can still find today. But as I ended up becoming a relative expert in makerspaces, libraries started to get some interest in makerspaces. And you might ask, why libraries? Why in the world would libraries be interested in making? Well, perfect person you can ask is a lady right over here who happens to be running the library program at the Central Library. But it comes down to this basic fact. Libraries have been providing free learning sources, free learning resources to the communities where they find themselves. And learning resources have meant for the longest time books. They've meant checking out DVDs. They've meant internet access. Those are the resources that were very important for a long period of time. And the world has changed. So new ways of providing resources to the community is one of the things that libraries are looking into, and making offers some possibilities. So we see libraries all around the country doing experiments. And then all of a sudden I started to realize that museums were getting into this. Why museums? I didn't have a lot to do with museums, but museums were where there you saw Maker Faire in Detroit. That's where the Maker Faire is. In Oregon, at OMSI, that's where the Maker Faire is. You go to Kansas City, it's the Science Museum there. Why are these museums getting into making? It's because, again, we've seen this transition from the analog into the digital, and the fact that the museums are not competing with all sorts of video games and what's on the web. They have to offer a more compelling proposition. And that compelling proposition is deeper insight into a topic, like Arduinos or robotics. And they can add that to what they do and continue to fulfill their mission. This show is a great example of how it started to penetrate schools. There's been this realization, and I like the way that some educators describe it. It's as though education is caught up with what neuroscientists have known all along, that when you do things with your hands, you learn better. That there are certain people who actually just learn better with their hands. In addition, there's a certain process in making that is useful in life. That is to say, when this young man in the front here is making something, some of the things that he's doing with these little building blocks will work, some won't. He'll end up making adjustments based on what won't work so that he actually learns something new. This iterative process of trial and error is a really great skill to learn, because if you have it, then you can educate yourself for life. Lifelong learning is a natural outcome of this, and the universities haven't missed out on that as well. And so making has slowly made its way into all these institutions, including for economic development. One of the funnest things going on right now is people developing businesses around what's possible. We have Robo 3D over here. We have D's makers, all sorts of people who have businesses now based on things that weren't even possible 5 years ago. And there are all sorts of new things that are being done. So this spectrum of institutions is being affected by making. And you can see that as I saw this play out, I couldn't help but become increasingly interested in the topic. And then one day I was on my way back from South by Southwest, and I had heard that at the time I was living in the Washington, D.C. area. But I was going from South by Southwest, and I was driving back home to D.C., and I'd learned that in Chattanooga, there was a library that was clearing out its entire fourth floor and turning it into a makerspace. I thought, that's curious. I've already visited many, many, many library makerspaces. Why not this one too? It's an entire floor of a library. And I went there, and there were 11 people at this meeting. And I have to tell you, my first reaction was, they're wasting a lot of time if 11 librarians are going to meet with me for a couple of hours. Well, it turns out that they weren't all librarians. In that room were a startup incubator, one of their companies. There was the local high school, there was a makerspace, 3 library staff, in addition there was a university, and the Science Museum. That was a representative from much of the ecosystem, much of the making community in Chattanooga. And it kind of blew me away because as the conversation continued, I realized that there was this mix of people, all representing different parts of the making community, and 8 of the 11 had only lived there for 3 years or less. They had moved to Chattanooga, a city that in 1970s was known as the most polluted city in the country, a city which was famous for having its rivers catch on fire, a city where every young person who wanted a future was leaving that town. They were bringing people in from outside to the promise of what was possible in Chattanooga. And the other people who were not represented in that meeting were the most impressive to me, which is the city government. The city government was aware of and supportive of all these groups. These groups had discovered one another, they had started to build collaborative relationships, and they were weaving a fabric. The goal of the city was they wanted to take advantage of this new way of producing things and become a regional production house. They'd been one of the big fabricators, the textiles industry, for generations. They had making in their DNA. This is the new platform that they wanted to build it on. So this is the first glimpse I had of something that we've called now Maker City. So I've described to you in a process that there is, in the beginning, just discovering. And you here are in a great place to discover. We have lots of makers, we have lots of schools, we have lots of businesses that are doing this thing. This is a great place for discovery. But discovery means you could just walk out the door and never do anything with it. You need to become familiar, just as in all these towns. Maybe the library was working with a makerspace. Maybe we had a school that was spending time with the Science Museum. These collaborations are the natural outgrowth of people spending time discovering, becoming familiar with one another, and then getting together. So about this time, I was moving to San Diego. It's about 2 years ago. And I found there were all sorts of players in San Diego doing all sorts of making. I mean, look what we have here. We have maker spaces. All 3 of these are represented here today. Libraries. We had different libraries that are doing making spaces. The Science Museum, the Fleet Center, has its Tinker, whatever it's called. We have schools, High Tech High, and a lot of other schools now are doing making. The universities, all the major universities are doing making. You have economic development. The city is actually fostering making, manufacturing, that sort of a thing. And then we have all sorts of others. Qualcomm has its Think-A-Bit studios that they work with schools on. You have incubators. You have communities of fabricators. All this was here in San Diego. And I was discovering these things. And I said, boy, I sure would like to work with some people to advance it from discovery to familiarity to then collaborating. And so along with 3 other co-founders, we went ahead and did a maker fair. And a maker fair, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a celebration of making. And you get a lot of that feel right here. People are very excited about what's possible, and they can see projects that people are doing, and they end up building relationships so that when you have left a maker fair, you're in a much better position to do some collaboration. And that was our goal, is to have this maker fair and bring everybody together. So this is what we had as our maker fair layout. And the only reason I point this out to you is because while most of this floor is makers, what you'd find in this corner over here, we have 40 makers over here. Most of this floor is makers. We deliberately brought in a variety of institutions so that they could discover one another, they could start to build relationships, and hopefully we get some collaborations out of it. So Qualcomm, for instance, had this large area right here. High Tech High had 16 exhibitor booths. We had some universities along here, but then this is the area that I found most interesting, because in this area, we called it the Maker Pro area, we ended up with all those people that we saw on the previous page, where we had our maker spaces, can we go back 2 pages? these are basically all these people that we had at Maker Faire. And over the course of that day, they were able to meet one another, start to build relationships. And I tell you, the goal again was collaboration after the fact. So let's go ahead, 3 slides. And amazingly, within 90 days of Maker Faire, there were 11 different collaborations that took place. So for instance, there was something called Steam Family Day at Balboa Park. We ended up with 26 makers at different museums in Balboa Park. So we were collaborating with the park. Makerspace came to the library and was doing programs. We had not only Maker Place doing something called Nerdy Derby, but we also ended up with the Fab Lab doing different things at the library. You ended up with Science Museum scheduling maker events. The Mobile Fab Lab was at the Science Museum. And a lot of other things happened. 90 days, folks, from an event like this, if you're deliberate, you can turn it into a way of building fabric, building fiber into the community of makers so that they can collaborate ongoing. But this was only a step. This is another very good step that we have here today. And yet they're just building blocks. To get to the Maker City requires something else. Next slide. Well, it just so happens that 6 months after our Maker Faire here in San Diego, we had Lindsay, ta-da, and his electric giraffe, ta-da, at the White House with the president, because the Maker Faire at the White House took place on June 19. But the Maker Faire was done at the White House because they sort of understood something fundamentally important was happening here for education, for commerce. They wanted to support that, but not just in the form of the Maker Faire. They had a couple of parallel initiatives, and one of them was called the Mayor's Maker Challenge. This is where the White House went out to mayors nationwide and said, we challenge you to accept some of these goals and deliver on them. And those goals are what we see here. A Maker Roundtable. That would be something where we get all the leaders, all these different institutions, and we get them together, and we get them to be familiar with one another and build a common agenda. Maker Faire. They were asking mayors nationwide to get together with locals and plan a Maker Faire. They were asking mayors to sign up for helping to create maker spaces, change the zoning laws, help foster with old city buildings, whatever, help maker spaces come into being. A couple of these things had to do with economic development. Usually there isn't somebody in the Economic Development Council that talks to makers or hardware makers because it's hard and there aren't a lot of people doing it. So add somebody to the mayor's office that deals with makers and change your rules so that maybe you can do things more readily with the Economic Development Council. All these things are the items on the Mayor's Maker Challenge, and there were over 100 mayors within 60 days that had signed up for one or more of these. So it'd be pretty easy to sign up for one, right? I'll appoint somebody to be a liaison. Oh, I'm on the list. Easy. To do more than a few of these things would be a challenge. Here in San Diego, Mayor Faulkner signed up for 9 of the 10 items from the Mayor's Maker Challenge. And the core team has been identified, and it's scheduling to be meeting and following through on 9 of those 10 items. So San Diego has great events, maker spaces, schools, etc., but they're all just ingredients in the mix. They need to go through discovery, familiarity, and collaboration. And even then, you need some high-level guidance to pull it all together. The Mayor's Maker Challenge could well be it. And if you'd like to know more about it, these are 2 URLs. If you want to remember quickly, it's MakerCon, which is a conference I do. MakerCon, Mayor's Maker Challenge, and the Mayor's Maker Action Report. So those are 2. You can't get it written down right now. That's fine. I'll be here afterwards. But the last slide is to make the point that this could, with all this great activity we have in the air, all these things like the STEAM Maker Festival, like Maker Faire, like what's happening at High Tech High and throughout the county, this could bring it all together and kick it up to the next level. And you can play a role in that, because this process of discovery, gaining familiarity, and collaborating can be done at every level. So you're here today. Become familiar with who these players are. Become familiar with what we have in our ecosystem here in San Diego. Then start to get to know them. And you'll find common interests. you will find that you're maybe driving to the same agenda. You'll find people who will complement what you want to do, and you'll want to start collaborating, because we need to build this fabric. Your being here is a great first step, or maybe it's your 10th step, but take advantage of it. Get to meet people, get excited about what's happening, and be excited for the Mayor's Maker Challenge when it finally comes into fruition. Anyhow, thank you very much.